delete it. Okay, so we're pretty much finished in terms of the definition of our Spark, our first component or our first playbook component for this data pipeline. So if I click on, so the first thing or the next thing I need to do is actually save this. So if I click on data pipeline and then save, it will then pull up this window which allows me to save my data pipeline. The first thing is file system. So the file system can be either local or it can be one of the cloud file systems, in which case you would then put the cloud file system that you're referencing. So for example, if I was connecting to S3 and storing this on S3, I'd put down S3 here. For this demo, we're storing it locally, so I'll leave it as local. Pipeline location. So this would be, if it was S3, the bucket that I'd be storing it into. Or if it's local, I can make use of the Windows or your operating system file dialog box. And if I double click on it, it will then pull up a file dialog box, which allow me to select where I want to put this. So let's pick a place. Let's create a new folder. Let's call it Demo 2. And it's generally good practice to store all your playbooks in a folder called Playbook. So let's create a new folder called Playbook. Playbooks. And all I want to do now is select that folder to say if that's where I want it to go. So as you can see, it automatically populates the pipeline location with the folder that we've selected. State directory. Every data pipeline which is executed will generate a number of state positions. So this is internal data that IOblend requires in order to maintain states, and that's its sort of position it's currently running in for a particular pipeline. So typically we will store it in the same directory as the playbook, because that denotes the project of the playbook, and we will just call it states. So let me just copy that. Last thing is to give it a name. So let's call this D2. Right, if I save that. Okay, so now that we've entered, now we've created our first component and we've already pre-populated the run configuration parameters for this data pipeline project, we should be able to execute it. So if we click on run, the first thing it says, so run will allow us to execute all the data pipeline components which reside within this data pipeline project, which obviously are sitting within the designer. So in this instance, we've only got one component, which is the source. So when you hit run, the first thing it says is, please ensure you've saved your playbook. So any changes that you make to the playbook, although you can see them on the screen, they're not saved automatically to the file system, just in case you don't want to do that. So you have to automatically do a data pipeline and save. Or manually do a data pipeline and save. So we've already saved that, so we know it's okay. So let's click on OK. Yes, I missed one parameter. Okay, so as you can see, if your parameters are not set up correctly, you'll get a warning which says, look, I can't run because you've not set up this parameter. So that particular parameter that it was complaining about was SSH. So if I go into my config, if I go to project, run parameters, if I go and have a look at it, and then if I scroll down, if you look at SSH, it's got nothing there. It's just the default value. But if you actually look at the description of SSH, it says, okay, so the options are either local, which means do not run by SSH, or the actual SSH command that you need to enter. So because we're running this local, what I need to do is put local here. Now I can run it. So now if I save this, I should be able to run it again. Okay. And now it's starting. So what we'll do as this is running, I'll go through the various things which are being printed up on the screen. So this is the run window. So what's happened now is we've asked IOblend Engine to take the metadata which has been created by IOblend Designer for this data pipeline project and execute it as a dynamic data pipeline. So it dynamically generates all the code in the background and executes it as a pipeline. So in order to do that, there are a couple of things, or there are a number of things that IOblend Engine has to do. So the first thing it has to do, as you can see at the top, it has to initialize the data pipeline environment. So it spends some time doing that. Once it's done that, it tells you the IOblend version number which is being run. As I mentioned before, we actually use the Spark framework in order for all our calculations. So IOblend engine, in order to use Spark, has to initialize the Spark session. So it does that. So that's what this message is saying here. It's starting to do it, and then it tells you the amount of time it takes to actually initialize that. I should mention what we're doing at the moment is we're running IOblend Designer and IOblend Engine from my desktop, because this is the Designer edition. So we've got both components running from here. Obviously, in production, you'd have the IOblend Designer if you're creating pipelines or you want to test a pipeline running from your desktop, and you have IOblend Engine actually running on your production or your cluster environment. So for example, if we're on AWS, you could have IOblend Engine running on EMR, or in fact, you could actually use the IOblend Engine setup files to create a Spark instance on EC2. Yeah, so therefore it's much quicker when you're running it across your production environment. So continue with this. So it's created the Spark session. So the next thing it has to do is then initialize the engine, which it goes about doing, and it tells you information about how long it's taking, what it's doing. Here we can see that the next thing it tries to do is load the playbooks and associated configuration. So it then tells us how long it took to do that. And then finally, it tells us what parameters that the engine is being executed with. And then lastly, it does the Spark initialization for the actual data pipeline that we're generating. Again, because we're using Spark, as you know, Spark gives you a web portal which allows you to look at the Spark setup and what's happening in the background in terms of its running. So you can get some rather detailed information about the individual tasks which are being executed by your Spark job if you want to. And to access that, the Spark Web UI, if you go to the URL which is provided here, you'll be able to see all of the Spark runtime parameters and information stats for the Spark pipelines which are being dynamically generated by our IOblend engine. Okay, then finally it tells you how long it took to do the initial setup. Now it's actually starting to execute our pipeline. So the first thing it does is it tells us the timestamp that it's reading the data from. And then, as you can see, we've asked it to or if you remember, we asked it to show us the schema. So the first thing it does, it says for the particular component that it's executing, which is this one here, source S3 static sensor 01, which is the component that we've created and the only component that we've currently created within the designer. It then shows us the schema. So here is a printout of the schema. So it breaks down the schema into key value pairs of the name of the column and then the data type that is automatically assigned to it. So most of the time initially, unless you define it, it will assign by default a string type to it. Okay. So after that, it then shows you output. So we've asked IOblend Designer, if you remember at the bottom, we said within IOblend Designer for this component, please show us the output and show us 5 records. So it's shown us, in this instance, we've only got 4 records. So it's shown us all 4 records. Now, so it's now completed. It's read the data. It's now outputted it. And that's the first iteration. So if you remember, within the run configuration, there was a value which said epochs. And I described that as the number of times an iteration will be executed. So if I click on yes, it will now go back and it will now reread that data again. This message here at source S3 static sensor 01, which is the component we're running, is asking us, do we want to continue? And the reason why we're getting this message here is because we said debug, or we set debug to true. And because we set debug to true, it will then stop at every one of these iterations, which allows to continue or not. So in this instance, if I was to do continue, do yes or no, it then goes off and then reads the data again. You can see it's because we clicked on yes, it's now showing us the second iteration is 2. So we're on the second iteration and it's going, right, now you're in second iteration. What do you want to do? Do you want to continue? Do you want to reset? Or do you want to quit? For this instance, the 2 values which are relevant to us are continue or quit. Continue means if I press continue, it will then go on and reread the data. Quit will end this pipeline. Now, what I should note is that you don't want to quit this. As you saw, it takes a little bit of time initially to set up IOblend engine. However, once it's set up, if you want to continue to either change this pipeline or add to it, you can continue to do so without closing this. So if I wanted to change this pipeline by adding something else to it, another component, or even change this initial component, all I need to do is, if I hit reset, it will then give us the options to leave this open, go back into the pipeline, make changes, save it, and then rerun it. So let's do that. Before I do that and quit, we'll just completely close this window for us. So instead of closing this window, let's leave this interactive debugger session open, and let's go make some changes to that data pipeline. So I will just click on reset. Okay, so now it says you have reset. Now would be a good time to clear checkpoints. So checkpoints are only valid for streaming sessions. And then it says continue, yes or no. So I don't continue just yet because I want to go back into Designer and make a change. So let's just close this down.